The gospel we just heard is a continuation of last Sunday's gospel. The same scene has been divided by half. And last Sunday we heard how Peter gave a really precise answer to the question, "Who am I?" that Jesus asked the disciples. So last Sunday we heard Peter giving a very precise answer. This Sunday, we hear Peter giving a really wrong and confused answer when he rebuked Jesus. Last Sunday, we heard that Jesus called blessed to Peter for the answer he gave. This Sunday, we see that Jesus no longer calls him blessed, but he says, "Get behind me." Last Sunday, Peter got a name change. He went from Simon to Peter. This Sunday, Peter also gets a name change. From Peter to Satan. He got a little bit undergraded this time. So on this homily, I would like to share with you a little reflection on this dialogue between Peter and Jesus. Peter, it appears to be that he tells Jesus something reasonable. He tells him, "God forbid that you should suffer." And it's interesting because the same phrase, "you should avoid suffering," is a phrase and a temptation that Jesus has in his own life over and over again. When you see the Gospels, the 3 years that Jesus had for public preaching, over and over again, Jesus receives the same temptation. You should avoid suffering. Do you remember, for example, when Jesus went to the desert, that also he was tempted by the devil, and the third temptation was, "I will grant you everything only if you adore me"? The devil is telling him, you can get to the point where you want to be taken without suffering. Do you remember when Jesus is praying in the Garden of Gethsemane, how he prays? He feels the same temptation. He says, "Lord, if it's possible, make this suffering go away, but I will do your will." But always the same temptation. Avoid suffering. Today, it's the same thing. Peter tells him, "Do not suffer." So it's interesting to see how the same temptation in Jesus' lives appears over and over and over again. So the question is, can we relate with this temptation? This temptation of avoiding suffering, could it be a temptation for my life and your life? How can we relate this recurring temptation in Jesus' life to your life and my life? And I think there's a very practical application. I think that is very usual for us to imagine in our lives a different situation where I could have everything that I want without suffering. And I'll give you examples. Sometimes we priests, when we're going through a rough time, we receive a temptation. And we say to ourselves, or someone says to us, "If you were married, things would be much easier. If you were married, you wouldn't have to suffer everything that you're going through." And then the same temptation comes to a married man. And the married man says, "If you were a bachelor, you wouldn't have to suffer everything that you're going through." And we start imagining a different situation in our lives where we could be happy without suffering. And then the bachelor comes, and the bachelor says to himself, "Oh, I'm so happy where I am." No, the bachelor says, "If I were married, maybe it's time to settle down, then I would be happy without suffering." The temptation is always the same. If you were in a different situation, you would be happy without suffering. And you know what, brothers and sisters? That is the greatest lie I've ever heard. Because every situation entails suffering. Either if you're married, if you're a priest, or if you're a bachelor. Whatever situation you take on your life, there's going to be difficulties. But the temptation is to imagine, if I were in a different situation, I would have no suffering in my life. But I want to offer you an insight. How does Jesus react to this temptation? He has a decided reaction. He says, Satan, go away from me. And the question is, how do we react against this temptation? Because we all receive this temptation. I can say as a priest, I sometimes feel tempted in this way. And the question would be, how do I act? And how do I face this temptation? Sometimes we start daydreaming. And we say, I'm considering my options. But Jesus teaches us that the right attitude is we should embrace the state of life and our vocation with passion in the same way that he embraces his mission with passion. So I think here there's an interesting lesson that we could take for our houses this week. The question would be, with how much passion do you embrace your actual state of life? I think that I should be passionate about being a priest. I think that I have to be passionate about being a spiritual father. And I think that I'm called by God to be passionate about this path that God has set for me. And I think that it's not different for parents and for spouses and for young people right now. We should embrace with passion our state of life. And I think spouses should embrace passionately their calling to love completely their spouses and to be completely devoted to the education of their kids. And you know what's the problem? When we stop being passionate and when we start daydreaming about other options, what should be a blessing seems to be a burden. I'll give you an example. I'm a priest, and sometimes I get a phone call, and someone tells me, someone is sick at the hospice, and you have to go there. And I'm doing different things. So my first reaction is, one more time I have to go to hospice to give the anointing. Why am I always interrupted? And then I stop and I say, hey, this is your state of life. You're a priest. This is a blessing to be able to give the anointing. And maybe it happens the same to parents. Sometimes they daydream about being something different, and their kids, they start to seem like a burden instead of seeing like a blessing. I want to finish my homily with this. Today, Jesus tells Peter, you're thinking like men, and you're not thinking like God. And I think this is something we also have to think about carefully. And I'll give you two examples of this, of how sometimes people can think like God and sometimes we don't. I want to give you an example from the scriptures. Do you remember that passage from the Acts of the Apostles? When the apostles went out to preach the gospel and the Jews punished them, and I think they scourged them for preaching the gospel after they had been forbidden to not do so. You know what the text of the Acts of the Apostles says? It says, the apostles left the site of the scourging happy for having received this punishment for the name of Christ. They were happy while being punished. They were thinking like God. And I'll give you a different example from my own life or from the religious life perspective. In our religious life is sometimes like the army. Those who came earlier into the army or those who came earlier into the religious life are supposed to receive some respect or some consideration from those who came later into the religious life. But sometimes you know what happens? You're older, but someone that came later into religious life than you is appointed superior. So you're like, now I have to obey this guy that is newer than me. Now I have to take orders from this guy that has less experience than me. That is thinking like men. The saints didn't think like that. The saints said, no matter who is in charge, I obey because it's God who is talking through the superior. So I want to offer you a very practical application for this week. If this week you have some type of suffering, if this week maybe you're sick, or if this week maybe you feel betrayed by someone, or if this week you have economical difficulties, instead of thinking like men, think like God. And I will give you a tip. It works. Believe me. Next time you face something difficult, give thanks to God. When I saw myself in a position where I had to obey someone that was younger than me, you know what was my best solution? I said, God, even though in my heart I feel rebellious, I want to thank you because I can obey like you, Jesus Christ, you did. So I invite you to thank God in this situation so that you can think like God and not like men. So brothers and sisters, what do I want to share with you today? Number one, we all feel the same temptation. There's a different situation in life where I would be happy. Don't believe that lie. Embrace your state of life with passion. And if you feel tempted to daydream of a different situation, you tell that temptation, Satan, go away. And second, this week, if you face a difficult situation, don't think like men, think like God. And my best tip is, give thanks for that difficult situation. And you'll see how you'll be able to make the transition to start thinking